Okay, so I'm actually going to remake a video that I made earlier because I think the sound wasn't particularly good, and maybe I could be better at going through the content. So for this one, we're going to look at methods. So methods are a really important point, a really important part of doing Java. And a key part of this is that it's modularity and reusability. And basically what that means is the modularity part means that we should be able to like break our code into small parts and break it so that if we come back to our code later, instead of having this big giant mess, we can kind of divide it up into portions. You can imagine, especially as our projects get larger and larger, more and more code getting written, if it's all in one spot, it's going to be really hard to look through and figure out what's going on. So what we want to do is use modularity, which just basically means, you know, we're going to break our code down into parts. We're going to take this part and we're going to maybe some section that's going to, I don't know, create a collection of random numbers, for example. That might go into one section, and you know, whatever else we're doing in the code is just going to kind of get broken up into pieces. And that's what modularity means. And it's an important part of organizing our code so that others can come back later and look at it, or you can go back later and look at it. Also reusability, because oftentimes we have methods, and we'll probably talk mostly about reusability here, because I think it makes sense now. Modularity will maybe make a little bit more sense later on. But your reusability, like if you have a set of code that you want to use many times throughout your work, then it makes sense that you don't have to retype it every single last time. So methods can really help with reusability. If we have something that we want to use like 5 times in our code, we can use methods to make this a lot easier to do instead of typing everything out. So let's look at that. One thing we might want to do, and oh yeah, and my other point here, other thought here is that we have seen methods before. Even though this might seem new, it's actually something we've seen a lot of. We just never really called them methods. And there's like one big major example, and then there's a bunch of other smaller examples that we've seen so far. So for example here, we already have, and you can find this in my, if you go to my Replit, which I think I have linked somewhere, make sure I include that link. You can find the chapters all in here. I'm going to organize these a little bit better, but this will be placed into chapter 12. So if you want to come back and find the replets, or if you want to find replets related to the chapters, they should all be posted in here, and I try and organize them as best I can. But okay, so going into this though, this line. So remember, this is a way of running a reader. Let's see, and we're just going to take in a value from the user, and we're not really doing anything with it. But this reader, we're using this reader to take input from the users. And this thing right here, this .next line, this is a method. This is an example of a method that we've been using. We just never really talked about it as being a method before, but that's what it is. We're taking in, and so what is a method here? A method is something that somebody else has created for us that we can use. Like, we don't have to code for how to take in input from the user. That's already been made by somebody else, and we can use it. So the same way we can use, and I mean, there's a lot of other methods that we have used. I mean, there's actually a few methods hidden in here already, but methods, we've been using methods that other people have written. But what we can do now is actually make our own method that's going to allow us to, and that we can then reuse later on. So for example, oftentimes what we need to do in our code is we need to figure out whether a number is odd or even. So we can write some really quick code. And so the way this could look, and I'm going to pause because I think my keyboard is really loud. So we could have code that looks something like this. We're going to take in a reader, we're going to take in an integer from the user, save it as num, and so actually like parseInt is also an example of a method that we're using. And we'll get into using like methods on, these are classes, like this integer thing is a class, scanner is a class. We'll get to classes a little bit later, but that's just like, so we might not know about that to begin with, but just kind of put that in the back of your mind. We'll figure that out a little bit later. But this, we're taking a value from the user, and then we're going to say, okay, if the remainder of dividing by 2 is equal to 0, then the number is going to be even. Otherwise, it's going to be odd. And if we run that, put in a number, okay, the number is going to be even, and that works. But you can imagine, like, if this is just one small part of the code, and there's a whole lot of other stuff going on. We're going to, and this is just one small section. We're taking input from the user, we're making random numbers, we're, if we're making a video game or any sort of more complicated program, you can imagine this is going to be really long. And like, we don't want to have all of our stuff packed into here. So what we can actually do, and hopefully, I'm going to try this with my keyboard. I don't know if it's maybe a little bit quieter here. It was super loud in the last one. But what we can do is take all this stuff and turn it into a method. And that method we're going to run, it needs to be outside of this. It needs to be, the method that we create needs to be inside of main. so within these brackets, but should not be inside of the main thing right here. We'll talk about that. We'll come back to that in just a minute. So when we identify when we want to create a method, there's a few things that are going to happen. To begin with, for right now, we're going to have a couple keywords. Oops, it always does that. I don't know why. We're going to have a couple keywords here. Public, static. We're not going to worry about these for right now. We will come back to them, I promise. But for right now, we're not going to. So public, static, whatever. In here, this is going to be what's called a return type. And then in here, we have the name of the method. And then in here, this is going to be our parameters. Which is basically like, what are we getting in from, like, when someone uses this method, what do they need to send into the method to evaluate? So like, for example, here, we want to figure out whether the numbers are odd or even. So if we're going to use this method, we should send in, like, okay, the values that we're trying to evaluate, or I guess the value that we're trying to evaluate. The name of the method, so that could be whatever we want. So the parameters are going to be, depends on what the name, what you're going to do with the method, like what kind of things it needs to have to run. The name of the method could be whatever you want, but it should be descriptive. You shouldn't just do like blah, 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 blah. You should type in a descriptive method name. So it could be something like, I'm just going to do, I'll just say even or odd. And you'll notice every time I get to a new word, this first letter is lowercase, but then the first letter of every following word is uppercase. And that's to kind of break this up a little bit. It's called, we've hopefully seen that before, called camel case. Now our return type. So and let's take in here, we're going to put in, we need to take in an integer. We could take in a double too, I guess, but in this case we're going to use an integer. And the integer, we can call it whatever we want. Like this could be, I'll come back to this in the replit a little bit, but I'm just going to call it num for now. But the name actually doesn't matter whatsoever. Now the return type. To begin with, what we're going to do is we're just going to put in void. And that means that there's nothing getting sent back as a result of this method. The method will run, it'll do some stuff, but it won't send back any information back to the user. We can print stuff, we can show stuff, but with a void return type, we're not sending anything back to the main program. And we can look at the counter version of that a little bit later on, and I'm sure that we do in another video. So let's take a look at this. So if we go into here, and let's go back to our replit here. So we're going to make a method, public static, and again, took them off of my keyboard there, public static. I mean, this part we'll get to, we just don't quite understand right now. And we're going to say even or odd. And in here we need to take in some sort of integer. And again, I'll mess around with this and I'll show that the name of this really doesn't matter at all. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this in, and we'll put it in here. And actually, I'll delete this. So now the code that we have up there is now contained within our method. And it's going to do basically the same exact thing. But now, to call this method, I just need to type even or odd. And then I'm going to send in the value. So I'm saving the value for my user as num, and I'm going to send that value into the even or odd function. And let's see if I put in 6. Now the number is going to be even, just like, so it's still working the way it did before, right? Let's see, try 3. Yeah, number's odd or even. Great. Okay, so what can we do here? A couple things, like num. So this thing does not have to match. Like, this is our main set of code. I'll give it a different name in just a second, but this name does not have to match what's happening in our main stuff, because it should take in a bunch of different values. Like, I should be able to take in another, like, integer, try, I don't know, like, oh no, we don't do try. Integer, let's say variable is equal to integer. Let me just copy this. And then we want to do this even or odd. But we want to pass in, I don't know, too much. But we want to pass in now variable. And let's run this. So we can pass in one number, we'll pass in another number. Right, so like this method, the reason we got 9 in here, the reason we got 9 was odd is because we're putting 9 in here, and then 9 is getting passed into the method. But you'll notice, like, this is var and this is num, like, they're not, the names aren't the same, and they don't really have to be. If these names have to be if they had to be the same, this code would never work, because like, okay, we have to make these things exactly match, but we might be putting in all sorts of stuff. So what we can do in here, this num actually doesn't matter. What does matter in here is that this num matches with this. So if I type in, this could be n, then I'd have to make this n too. These are just kind of matching. It's saying, basically the way the code is working is we're sending in this var into this even or odd method, and then it's going to take the place of wherever we see n within this set of code. So we see n here, okay, we'll replace that with the value of this variable. Yeah, and it's going to work like that. Okay, so the one last thing that I think I want to talk about here is that this thing itself is a method. And you can see like public static void string, like these are, this says even or odd, this says main, but overall like the beginning setup is all the same, and that's why this is actually called the main method. So this is just another example of a method. Same way even or odd is a method, the main set of code is called the main method. It's kind of like a special case though in Java, because when we start I start this every time I record a video, that thing goes off. But whenever we start our Java code, the first thing that's going to look for is find a main method, and that's because it needs like a starting place to get going. So the first thing it does is go and find the main method, and then it's going to start working its way through there. So we need to have this code word up here, and like we could see this if I deleted this and just said the min method, nothing else changes, and we're going to get an error. It says the main method not found in the class main. So this method is not found. They're looking for that keyword. If I just put that a back in there, now they know exactly, oh yeah, okay, I know where to go. So this video is actually a lot longer than the last one, but I'm going to stop it right now. Methods are a really important and high-level concept that we need to use.